This is the 88 Ranger. You always have to see good enough to ride, right? This is a clean, healthy looking little pickup.
Pretty.
And sometimes whenever you got a clean, healthy looking little pickup, or whatever, like this one out here that Melissa just went and got back is a really clean, healthy looking little pickup, and I'm sure it probably is. Well, this one right here had a particular story about it. Some of you may have seen a little rundown I made. I'll put this on my technical rider page, but you're going to get to see the pictures this time. What we had here was this guy says, I bought an alternator from whatever brand parts house it was, which I can say it because they didn't do anything wrong. It was AutoZone. And he says, and smoke started coming from under my dash, and so I took the alternator back and says, your alternator tried to burn my truck up, and so I want something done about this. And they said, I'll tell you what, they were straight up. They said, you take that thing up to the Ford dealership, we'll give you your old alternator back, and we will pay for whatever damage was caused if it was caused by our alternator. Fair enough, right? That's totally fair. I thought it was fair, you know, and they did a great job of that. Okay, so what happened was, I says, first thing I did was I started it up, right? Now, I will tell you one thing. It doesn't take very much wire to fill the whole cab up with smoke. You got me? A little bit of piece of wire 6 inches long to fill the whole cab up with smoke, make you think you've destroyed your whole wire harness. Okay, so here we go. The melted wire, it could have been running along the top of the big horns under the dash, or it could have been just about anywhere. Well, I hooked up the charging system tester, which was a MacB CH35. It's a big old, it's about the same grade of tester as we got out here, except it wasn't digital. It had needles on it. And we bought it when the VAT-40 died, which we love that thing. But anyway, the alternator wasn't charging, but the alternator itself got hot enough to fry egg immediately. And it was making a lot of noise. You could feel the heat from 6 feet away. It was really, really hot. All right, the first thing we had to have was an alternator. An alternator, so he was contacted, and they brought one from the parts store. I put it on, and it was cranking out 50 amps. Now listen to this. This is really important. 50 amps coming out of that alternator, but the battery voltage, now I say there was 50 amps, there was 50 amps making it to the battery. Of course, you can just way higher if you measure it in the alternator. But the voltage was right about 12. Now, what do you usually see when a charging system's working? How many volts do you usually see?
14.
About 14 and a half. This one here was cranking out a lot of amps, but we had low voltage. Now, what do you think about that? I was scratching my head about that. We've got 12 volts, but we're putting out about 50 amps that's making it to the battery. What the heck is this? Now, this is like a 90 amp alternator, but 50 amps is coming to the battery, okay? All right, so he came by. He just got a little bit irritated because we hadn't been able to blame AutoZone for it, but I said, they ain't done nothing wrong. Your other wire was burned slam up. Okay, so the wires that carry the, and I said, I don't know how an alternator could make smoke come from under the dash, because the only wire that goes inside the truck to the alternator is one going to the light on the dash. So how's that going to make smoke come from inside the dash? It don't make any sense to me. So anyway, here I sat down in the driver's seat after the truck ran a little bit, and I saw the cab filling up with smoke. Right? All right, so then I started investigating where that was coming from. Oh, incidentally, here's our low output. By this time, we had, or this particular time, I was at idling instead of 1500 RPM. We had 25 amps, and our voltage was just below 12. These are actual photos of the charging system tester. This little light over here, you know, was the one wherever you would do your 15 amp load and all that kind of stuff. That's what it was for. All right, so this is what I saw when I got out under the dash. There's my little Mac Tools flashlight in my hand here. The inertia switch was fried. Somebody had actually taken the inertia switch and clipped it out of the circuit and wired these two wires that went in the inertia switch together.
Really? They bypassed it?
Yeah, and a lot of the times you'll find inertia switches will have a tendency to burn up anyway, right? All right, so the inertia switch burned up on this one. And I said, well, there's a connector that comes with it, a little connector shell, and there's basically some new terminals, and the inertia switch, like $75 for that. And I said, okay, I'm going to fix this, and I'm going to put this back in here, and we're going to see what happens. Now, I figured, well, if you've got a lousy splice here, and there's current flowing through this to the fuel pump, you're liable to have some issues, you know, because of the voltage drop. Now, you can have some voltage drop, and the fuel pump will still perform pretty good. Because on some of the older cars, they actually put a resistor in there to drop the fuel pump voltage to 8 volts, so it wouldn't be so noisy. So it's not unusual for the pump to put up enough pressure, even if it's dropping some voltage. All right, so here we go with that. Now, fix that. And then I got down in the truck and I cranked it up again. And I'm watching to see if smoke's coming from anywhere else. And the next thing you know, I'm seeing a little smoke under the hood, and about the time I focused under the hood, it burst into flame. Out there on the right side, right in front of the hinge, the hood hinge on the right side, a fire started. It was ugly. And I said, what the heck is this all about? Okay, now this right here is the fire damage. It happened under the hood. Now this is the blower motor, and I was sitting in there and I could see because the hood was up, there's a gap there. All of this fire took place right here. Now, this component with this green connector that's totally destroyed is the fuel pump relay. On that 88 Ranger, the fuel pump relay was mounted over there on the firewall like that. Okay, I say you call it the firewall. I guess it could be called a firewall here because it kept the fire out of the truck, didn't it? But anyway, you're supposed to call it the bulkhead because it ain't really there to stop a fire. But the long and short of it was that other relay down there, and I remember the heat power relay, and you know, it didn't really do anything. Okay, so here I am with my little fix-it operation. This looks familiar, doesn't it?
Yes, yes.
And this took place many, many years ago. I got some heat shrink, I got some solder, and I'm putting a brand new pigtail on here. It's always a good idea to replace a pigtail. If you don't replace your pigtail, then you're not fixing it right. This is all there is to it.
Can't take it. I got it.
Okay, all right. So I put the pigtail on there. All right. And then I got a little farther into the job. This is what it looked like after I got through with it. See, that's a good repair, isn't it? I've got a nice, strong solder joints here with high quality heat shrink. I got my new fuel pump relay up here. This is a little scorched, but I didn't replace it for looks, you know. Excuse me, that's the power relay, that's the AC relay, I believe. But the long and short of it was, this is what it looked like when I got done. All right, you got me?
Okay.
Pretty good. All right, so.
Was that the problem only?
Well, that was a effect. The cause is yet to be seen. In other words, I'm still finding out what the cause was. You got me? Now, this is an unusual truck because it's a Ranger with dual tanks. Note this. A Ranger with dual tanks. You notice you got two pumps. You have a fuel tank selector switch that's under the truck on the frame. Excuse me, the valve, there's a valve and a switch made together that moves the changes for the gas. It's going to put the fuel return and the pressure, you know, going to the right tanks and all that. This is the switch on the dash where you go front tank, rear tank. Got me? All that kind of thing. And you got an inline high pressure fuel pump. So the little pump in the tank is only here to keep this one primed on this one. In 1990, they went to just a pump in the tank. They got rid of the one on the frame. That 89 Bronco we got's got one of these big ones on the frame, but it's got one in the tank too. If the one in the tank doesn't work, then the one on the frame will lose its prime sometimes. So if you got one that's got a pump on the frame like that 89 Bronco, and sometimes it doesn't, you know, it cuts off on them. The first, I always unplug the big pump on the frame, put my ear against the tank, turn it on, and see if the little pump in the tank's running. Whee! The one in the tank is not a positive displacement pump like this one. It's actually a little. It's almost like a windshield washer pump, but it moves gas, and it just feeds this one with fuel. Okay, so you got a pump here, you got a pump here. When you switch from one tank to the other, you're having this, you know, this little fuel tank switch. It's got a motor in there. There's a couple of diodes here. You see that? Then this flips over here, and that's basically going to operate that. It changes so that the fuel tank sending unit you're reading is from the proper tank as well. See, there's a lot of stuff going on there. All right, so if you look at this, the problem that I had, the inertia switch burned up, right? You got that? Now the relay is upstream of this. Initially, the inertia switch burned up, and then that strengthened that link in the chain, and the next weakest link in the chain that had already been having some trouble actually was the relay. See, from the fuel pump relay? All right, the fuel pump relay had fried, and I don't have that on the schematic, but you didn't need to see it anyway. So the suffice to say, it turns on, and it comes down here. All right, so I'm starting to look at these connectors along this line here, and I want to know what the heck is going on. I'm noticing that I've got burned wires over here under the doggone master cylinder. You see that? See all these wires here? You see how that wire is made? It's burned through the tape and it's made itself naked. And then we got all of this garbage. When I split that, that's what it looked like. That was horrible, wasn't it? And this is all part of the same symptom. Got me? All right, so wow. I disconnected it. This is another shot of it. There's the connector disconnected from it. I unplugged that, and this was beginning to melt that plastic. Okay, now what are you guys thinking at this point?
Something is,
Wait, is that the fuel pump connector?
It's going, the power of the fuel pump is going through there, going through that harness.
got a lot of resistance, making a lot of heat.
All right, what is it that makes heat? Well, resistance kind of makes heat, but there's something else that can cause heat too.
Voltage causes heat.
Huh? Well, I mean, what about, well, and Willie's close. All right, what we had here, this is the tank selector switch. This tank selector switch, actually changes power from one pump to the other, that kind of thing too. And it's kind of melted too. See, it's sort of got a little distortion going on there. All right. So what I did was with my meter, I'm an inductive clamp. I'm sorry, from my battery tester. I got around the line going to the fuel pump. How much have I told you guys that a fuel pump's supposed to have? Supposed to be pulling? If it ain't pumping no fuel, it's pulling about what? 1.5 amps.
Yes.
If it's pumping fuel, it's supposed to be maybe 8, no more than 10.
Right.
Usually it's 6 to 8. Can be 8.5, 9, 10 amps. This pump was pulling 40 amps.
Holy crap.
That's what my problem was. That's why it was showing 12 volts. It was load testing the charging system all the time. When you load test with that charging system tester out there, what happens? The carbon pile in the charge system tester makes a direct short between the positive and negative, pulls the voltage down, your amperage goes up because the regulator picks up on that. But what do you see coming out of the place where the carbon pile is? You see heat. Well, this carbon pile was not a carbon pile, it was wires going back there. I disconnected the big fuel pump, energized the relay. The 40 amps stayed. All right. I disconnected and I was listening, and the one in the pump in the front gas tank, there was a rear gas tank and a front gas tank. A little cigar-shaped tank and a flat one in the back. I disconnected the front gas tank, and the front gas, when I disconnected it, the amperage went away. I flipped the switch to the rear tank. That was after I fixed all these wires. I flipped the switch to the rear tank, and it was pulling about 8 amps. So what's that telling me? The front pump, the pump in the front tank, the windings are fried. So it's pulling 40 amps. It's putting an incredible load. The weakest link in the chain died first. That was the the inertia switch. All right. They just basically tied the wires together and taped it up because they figured out the inertia switch was, burned up or whatever. The next thing that happened was the alternator was having to work really, really hard, and so the alternator was already old, and so the alternator died. You got me? You see all this, the way this went? All right, so the next thing that happened after he put a new alternator on there, and it was really strong and powerful and able to punch out a lot of amperage. And so what happened after that point was the smoke came from under the dash. See, I kept having to go backwards to find all of this stuff out and everything. Well, anyway, when everything was all done with, I says, you're going to have a tank for a pump for the front tank because it's pulling too many amps. And he goes, oh, well, I don't want to spend that money. I just won't use that tank.
Seriously?
And that's the way it ended. I told him if we put a pump in this tank, if you ever put it on that tank again, all this will happen again. We already fixed all them wires and everything. I don't even remember what this job cost him, but it wasn't cheap. And it wasn't AutoZone's fault. AutoZone sold him a good alternator, and that alternator, when it was punching that extra juice through there, that's one of the things that made all that happen. Okay. So, anybody got any questions or comments about this? Didn't take long to tell the story, but there's a ton of lessons here, right? All right, now, initially, what's on the surface is I've got a charging system. Here's another reason why checking the charging system with nothing but a voltmeter is not a good idea. You got me? If you put a brand new alternator on there and you're still seeing less than 12 volts, you're thinking something's wrong with the alternator, right? But that amperage was going somewhere else, and it was pulling the voltage down. That makes sense. All right, so you're basically got to look beyond what's on the surface, and you got to be able, and looking at a wiring schematic is important too. You see where I'm going with that? But you got a perplexed look on your face. What's up?
No, it's just me.
Yeah.
So you said that the alternator was pushing out 50 amps.
Right? It was. If 50 was making it into the battery, the other 40 was going to that daggone pump. See, it was a 90 amp alternator, as I remember, and about almost half the amperage it was putting out was going through these wires.
And you got that with the inductive clamp?
Yeah. The inductive clamp will tell you the truth about where the current's flowing. If you go on the alternator, you'll see 90 amps. If you see 50, go into the battery because the voltage is low. And if you can measure, and I actually measured the other when I clamped, if you'll find where it is, if you can figure out. And I said, okay, obviously since the fuel pump relay caught fire and everything, I need to get on the wire going to the fuel pump and see what it's pulling. And it was 40 amps. And I said, that ain't no way. That's over 4 times. That's like 5 times what it should be going to that pump. See, that's an unusual problem, but occasionally you're going to see a motor, a fan motor will do that sometimes. It'll start pulling a ton of juice in it, but it'll typically pop a fuse. Well, the problem with this one was it wasn't fused. It had a fusible link, which is made to take a pretty strong surge without popping. It wasn't a dead short. If it had been fused with a regular fuse, it would have popped that fuse. And because it didn't have a fuse and it just had a fusible link that was like a couple of sizes smaller than the wire it was protecting, and it had the hypalon insulation over it, it was able to carry that. You see what I'm saying? And that's why it didn't blow a fuse and it just burned everything up with that slightly higher amperage and all that. That's what it'll do. If it's not enough amperage to blow the, to burn the fuse link out or whatever, all it'll do is blister the wires. They get hotter and hotter and hotter, and it'll blister them starting from where the load is going back toward the power. You see, and so I've seen a zillion of those. All right, I'm going to go ahead and pass you guys out your written test so you can blow through your written test, and we're going to see what we can. Okay, this is going to be our little quick written test on this where there's smoke. Smoke coming from under the dash usually means what?
At least 1 wire is overheated.
At least 1 wire is overheated and burning, and it doesn't take very much of a wire to fill the cab up with smoke. Tell you something else about that acrid smoke that comes off burning wires. Try not to breathe a lot of it and get the windows down. You know what I mean? Because it ain't good for your lungs. What turns on a voltage regulator on a Ford charging system? Nope.
Voltage coming to the indicator lamp.
Voltage coming to the indicator lamp bulb
I
and
didn't
circuit.
think that was
Y'all
wrong.
knew that. That's B. That's B. Voltage coming through the indicator lamp bulb and circuit. Logically, what conditions would prevail if the indicator lamp wire was severed but not shorted to ground?
The charging system wouldn't operate.
And
The
battery light would never come on.
So B.
Yep. What purpose is served by the inertia switch?
It cuts power to the fuel pump in the event of a collision.
If you crash, they don't want the fuel pump running. Now, not every vehicle has an inertia switch on it. You understand what I'm saying? Hybrid vehicles typically do, because they want all the contactors in that high voltage battery pack assembly and all to shut down when you crash. But inertia switches are basically accident related devices, you know. When the inertia switch melts and causes an open circuit, it always means,
There's a high current load somewhere on the circuit.
yep,
I said C.
or the inertia switch has been operated with a button in the up position. What would happen if the inertia switch has the button in the up position?
Wouldn't run.
Now, sometimes it can mean, and there's 2 answers here that are similar. Terminal oxidation has caused resistance, in which turn caused enough heat to destroy the switch. That's usually what it means. It doesn't usually mean the other, but you can get credit for that. When the inertia switch is found to be melted, what should you do next?
Both A and C, or A
Yeah,
and C.
yeah. The replacement inertia switch should be installed, and the possibility of current overload in the fuel pump circuit should be investigated. What's the best way to splice wires in an automotive circuit?
Solder
Cheap
and
butt
AC.
splices from the parts store.
Scotch locks? Yeah, right. Okay, I got nothing against Scotch locks if you're not using them in a high current circuit. I don't know at the times I've seen people come in, they got all these running board lights on their truck and everything, and they say, my park lights don't work. And then when you find out they've Scotch locked into those brown wires going back there, and all that extra current, well, that switch is burned up the doggone headlight switch. The part of it that feeds them lights, you know, you have to replace that connector, kind of like what we did on this one here. You know, that Jeep here, we had that burned up connector. What is a good way to isolate a short or a high current load in a circuit?
B.
B.
Isolate the different parts of the circuit by unplugging connectors all along the way and checking the circuit after each connector is unplugged to see if short goes away. You got to do that in a methodical fashion. You got to know where it is that your power is starting on your schematic, and which connectors are, how to locate the connectors. When you unplug them, if it goes away, you also have to factor something else in. If that same connector carries power in both directions, sometimes power will be going out and the ground will be coming back through that same connector. Now, in extreme circumstances, you may have to unkey a wire out of a connector shell and pull it back to isolate a circuit while leaving a connector plugged in. You know what I'm saying? So if you unplug it and it goes away, if this is a connector that's got like 40 wires in it, I mean, there's just too many wires going through there, and there's too much of a, you know, of a chance that you may be not finding your problem that way. So you're going to have to isolate your circuit one way or another. And I like to do it with just one. And if I've had in a situation I have, in extreme cases, you know, I always find a place where that wire is up here, where it's easy to get to, and cut the wire. And then whenever you're done, you solder the wire back together, put E-string on it. But to make sure when you cut it, it's not in a hard place to get to. Because you don't have to stand on your head under the hood, you know, and this kind of stuff.
Or on an oxygen sensor.
Yeah, that's right. Oxygen sensor, you're really not supposed to splice the wires, but the universal ones come with butt splices on them. And, I don't like that, you know, because some of that oxygen goes through those wires, you know, and a lot of people don't know that. The alternator from the parts store did what? Smoked out the problem, made it worse by increasing the charging system performance, and basically I was walking through there finding the weak links in the chain, which led me to the cause of the concern. And finally, a fusible link, what? It's always at least one size smaller than the circuit is protecting, and it also has Hypalon insulation on it. And it looks like a plain old piece of wire, but I will tell you, a fusible link is going to be made, if you've got a real fusible link, it's going to be made out of a different kind of wire than a regular wire. It won't be copper, although sometimes when you buy a real fusible link wire, you'll see a copper one. Anyway, that's